We'll give it a moment, just let everyone get settled, sit down, and I think we're all ready to go live. All right. Welcome to the Joy of Automating. I'm your host, Franklin Weber. Joining me today is Eric Maxwell. Welcome, Eric.
Hey, how's it going?
It's going well. It's going well. All right. I'm glad you could join me for this exciting 10th episode here. And what's exciting about in this episode is we're going to focus on refactoring our code with helper methods. So we've done a lot of refactoring over a couple of episodes. This one in particular, we're going to focus on looking at how we can essentially look at a community cookbook, refactor the code for clarity with helper methods, and then doing it safely because we're going to do it with tests and tests in mind. And if we have time, we'll look at even refactoring and testing some of those particularly hard helper methods with a lot of external dependencies. So let's get started. All right. So this week we're going to focus on a community cookbook, similar to last week. And in this episode, we're going to clean up a little bit of the NTP cookbook. Now, we're not going to focus on opening up pull requests and sort of going through the process. We're just going to practice locally with the NTP cookbook. And NTP is one of those cookbooks that you sort of you take for granted, right? Like the whole NTP project itself is something you might take for granted. Eric, you were telling me that you know the individual that works on the project?
Yeah. His name is Harlan, and he's been, I guess, the sole owner of the project for quite some time. And he's apparently kind of sick of working on it, or I guess kind of sick of investing his own time and energy and money into the project. And apparently, it's one of those things where it just works, and it's been working for a long time, and the project isn't something that's, I guess, sexy enough to attract new developers. People, I guess, don't really want to work on it because it already does its thing.
Right. Okay. The features are defined. It's just fixes and things like that, and that's not the work that a lot of people want to do. That's kind
Yeah.
of where the NTP cookbook is at the moment. It's one of those where I think it's been around for a while. It does what it needs to do. Most people don't open it up and take a look at it, but that's what we're going to focus on today is taking a look at that. So I'm excited to take a look. So first things first, I've downloaded the cookbook. Let's just look. So this is on GitHub, of course. I believe it's under the Chef Cookbooks organization. And there's the NTP Cookbook. It's gotten some work and some love, thanks to Tim at Chef. Tim, right? Yeah, Tim at Chef six
Yeah,
days
that's
ago.
him.
He's been doing some work on it. I might need to update my version, but I've cloned it down already, at least the version that I want to focus on for today. And it's a good cookbook, like in terms of like its setup, its execution, what it does for you. Let's take a look at just the README as I allow for my editor of choice, slow as it is to start up this morning. There we go. All right. So let's look at the README. So the README for the NTP cookbook is all about network time protocol. So NTP standing for network time protocol. This cookbook takes care of all of the communication from like your server to, I imagine, some sort of time server, and allows it to synchronize the time. And that's the whole network time protocol setup is. So it's important. I know that I don't know if you've run into that experience, but I've talked about it for sure, which is, the chef client runs, they can fail sometimes if your machine is not, if the time is drifted 5 minutes, 10 minutes, and things like that. I don't know if you have any
Yeah.
experience where the, NTP is important and it's saved you or sort of given you reprieve from sort of security or anything like that.
Yeah, I haven't experienced that in the field directly. I have read about it though, and how important it is.
Yeah. And I've definitely looked at that in terms of issues. Like I've seen it and I played with it, clockwise. So this cookbook has a number of recipes. I think it just provides recipes in terms of its implementation. It doesn't have any custom resources or anything like that. And there's a large number of configurable sort of attributes. That's how it really does all of its work. There's a default recipe here, and the default recipe in this case goes through and loads some helper methods and then does some big work here. So we can kind of take a look at this, but there's a few recipes: default, undo, Windows client, and then app armor. Yeah, I'm not familiar with undo or Windows client versions. I assume Windows is for the Windows one, and we'll get to look at that. The undo is the undo, maybe probably like remove it or something like that. And I'm not sure what app armor is. Maybe that's the application armor or something special for it. So I guess it's any good place. Let's start in this one here. So let me get my big head out of the way. I'll leave you looming over the code there, Eric. All right, so there's the helper methods in the beginning. So we see those. So this pulls in some helper methods that already exist, and that's something that we can talk about later. And that's really what we're going to kind of focus on. But really, we should not just say like, hey, let's start putting some helper methods in our code. Really, we should start looking at our code and seeing what's important and what makes sense. So a lot of times I like to pull in helper methods or use helper methods because what I want to do is make my code more clear. I might take some complicated logic, put it under a helper method. I might move some sort of, some material into a helper method. And it's hard to know when to find that helper method. So my hope is that we'll look at this code, we'll kind of see some things, and hopefully find something that might be worthy of like a helper method, something that might be made more clear if we wrote more intentional code.
Yeah. Hey, also for clarity, for those that don't know and that might be new, why don't you explain what a helper method is exactly?
Oh yeah, that's a good idea. So a helper method is any method, and actually let's look at some of these within this recipe right here. So this is first and foremost, actually you'll notice it's saying, hey, I want to take the chef resource, and it's saying I want you to include the NTP helper class. So there's this class structure right here that contains some helper methods, and the include says take any methods that are inside of that and then put them inside of the resource object, which means make them available. So you'll probably notice it when we scroll down. Let's see, I could probably find a good example of it. Here we go. NTPD supports native leap files. Let me move my picture out of the way here and we'll be able to check that out. So here we see this. NTP supports native leap files. This is not something that I see defined in the file anywhere, right? Like I see it as this variable that's being assigned to a key value pair, but I don't see the method anywhere inside of here. And this is what probably is a helper method, right? So this method contains some details, which when invoked, return back some content that we're going to be using inside of the template. And it's really just a Ruby function or a Ruby method that is going to do some work for us in another location. So a lot of times you might have recipes that get pretty messy, and the code inside of this recipe get really ugly, and oftentimes you want to move some of that logic to another location. And I think this is exactly what that NTP supports native leap files does. So if I scroll back through here, I think, yeah, here it is. Remember, so let me split the pane like this. So here's the helper file. Let me go back to the recipe so we can take a look. So there's that NTP supports native leap files. So you see this method here. Here's that NTP D supports native leap files. This probably looks familiar because remember it said ops code NTP helper. Well, that's what this is right here. You see this says ops code NTP helper. So this is all sort of like almost a logical structure that sort of contains the helper module, and that helper module contains a number of methods, and when you include it, those methods become available. So this NTP supports native leap files method is essentially like as if we defined it inside of the file over here, right? So all this does is really just kind of take care of that. And so
the modules are like it's like a namespace basically.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, namespace type of thing. Yeah, that's exactly it. And so you bring up a great point, which is talking about NTP supports native leap files. This is really just a Ruby method that's contained within a namespace module that we include into any recipe that we want, and that allows us to gain access to it and maybe reuse it across multiple recipes, or in this case, we might be able to test it, refactor it, sort of change it independently, hide some of the implementation details, make the recipe a little bit cleaner, et cetera, et cetera. So that's what we're going to focus on. I think in the same way that this NTPD supports native leap files, I'd love to look at the rest of this recipe and see what we could do to kind of go for some clarity. And we're not looking for big wins, right? When we do some refactoring like this, we're just looking for how can we make the code look a little bit cleaner and more clarity and clear code that makes sense. That we can go back and read it later, after 6 months or a year, and kind of go, yeah, I still get it. So let's start at the beginning here. So I see this. It says, if the platform family Windows include the recipe NTP Windows client, else do this code right here. So this is one of those things which is hard to see, but I think this is one of those moments where I'd almost debate, maybe this content inside of this else should be in its own recipe or something like that, because you might miss where the else starts and where this end is and that kind of thing. I think that's tricky. That's something we can look at.
That's kind of where I was going to go with that. Yeah, I mean, if we have an include for Windows, then we might as well have an include for other platforms as well, right?
Yeah. Why don't in this case? I mean, what if we thought about it? It would be what, include recipe NTP. It's not Windows. I mean, I guess we could just assume it's not. We could call it the not Windows client, which is really what it is, right? Because it's not Windows. We could make an assumption that it's like Linux, Unix. We could just say other client or default client. How about default client?
Yeah, I like default.
All right, default client would make sense because that's kind of what we're assuming here. You're just not Windows. So I'm going to take all the code, and that's kind of a good refactor right away. So that's not anything that it's not really a helper method, but this is kind of a nice refactoring that I like to do as well, which is this sort of include sort of refactoring, which has a good chance of sort of raising clarity of our code. But before I make this change, let's run some tests. Let's see if we've got all our tests working, and then let's see if we can make a failure and then see what would happen. So I'm going to comment that out, and then I'm going to return back to here. And let's run the code and see what happens. So I've got that here, so I'm going to run rspec. I don't think I've made any changes to that code base, hopefully. And it looks like we're doing well. So it looks like there's all passing tests, and then there's some pending tests going on, but not yet implemented tests. That's fine. So we'll assume, or I hope that the implemented ones are at least covering our code. The one way to prove that is we could just run this, right? So I could say include default client. I'm going to cut this code out, and then I'm hoping that we'll see a failure. So all I did was I said include recipe. I specified the recipe name. I created the recipe, but you notice the content of that recipe is blank. So, and then let's see what we get. If we don't see anything failing, then oh, that's good. I was about to say, if we don't see anything failing, Eric, we got some more work to do.
Yeah.
All right. So this looks good.
That's about what I would expect.
Right, exactly. Like, hey, there's some expectations on particular recipe stuff to being called, and it's not getting called, so we need to do that. And I think what's actually happening is, if I didn't see it inside this code here, AppArmor is possibly getting called, right? So that's one of the test failures we see here. It's saying, hey, I expect it to include AppArmor, right? But AppArmor is not there because that little code that we cut out, or I cut out right there, is really not present. So I'm going to cut that and paste it inside of here and look at the default recipe, and I'm just going to run that again and see if we get everything passing. Really, we just did a simple thing. I mean, this is one of those quick refactorings that I think delivers a lot of value.
Yeah, definitely cleans up the default for sure.
Yeah.
Can we take a look at, after you rerun these tests, can we take a look at that Armor Ruby file?
Yeah, let's take a look at that one. So this should pass. It's one of those things where I'd be surprised if it didn't. That passes for us. We still got some untouched resource and things like that. Yeah, let's take a look at AppArmor. So it looks like this gets called, and this is it. And it's just 31 lines. So service app armor, action nothing, but then it says cookbook file, when I drop this app armor configuration in place, restart the app armor. So app armor doesn't get started or restarted until we drop a configuration file in place. And let's go back to the code that actually calls that. This one right here, include recipe NTP app armor if node NTP app armor is enabled. Okay.
So that must be an attribute, obviously, we can set.
Yeah, so that seems pretty clear in terms of like include this recipe, run this code if you happen to enable it. I like, good flags with good names like that. All right, that feels pretty good. I don't see much to do in terms of work on this code right here, but I think this is a huge benefit for this readability. Again, like we were talking about, just a simple case like this case statement, this if else, and right now there's a parity. I kind of think of it like a seesaw a lot of times when I look at code like that. So before it was like a seesaw and it was like, or a, balance. We've got this heavier sort of object, this heavier, longer, bigger piece of code, and we've got this lighter, smaller amount of code on one side. And I think in some cases that creates like a problem, right? That for our mental model, when we look at the code, it can be a little confusing. Why is there not the same thing? Why aren't they the same thing? So I think this is a great choice. Well, let's look at the next little part right here. If node NTP servers is empty, set the node default NTP servers to this value, then log a message.
So that looks like maybe something we could extract out into a helper method.
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking too, right? So in this case, if we see this, it says, hey, if the servers are empty, so it's asking the node object for the attributes NTP servers, and this I assume is an array. And if the array is empty, then we're setting up default values for us. Yeah, that's something that seems like it'd be nice if we could say something like set default NTP servers, right? We could just kind of like, if we saw that, this would be the thing. Because a lot of times I kind of think about when you should make a method. Here's my kind of rule for like when a method may be or should be appearing. I don't know if you have a feeling on it. But if I write a comment above a block of code and that comment above a block of code tries to describe it, then that means I probably need to come up with a method for it, right? Because that's really what's kind of happening. And so I think in the case here, this seems like, this block of code, what is it doing? It's setting the default NTP servers for the node object. So, we could call it set default NTP servers for node, or just set, I think that works pretty well. And so this is one of those things where I think a good helper method would be all right. So we can actually do it here first. So let's actually write it here. Because if I just add this, I think we're going to see a failure, and I'd love to see that. So just adding that method alone, I think we get a good test, which is, hey, does that method exist? And it doesn't, and I think we get a good failure. This is going to break. It says, yeah, no resource or method or local variable name set NTP or default NTP servers, and it fails right away. So the rest of these are going to fail, and that's what we expect. So let's actually define that method. To define a method in Ruby, we use the def keyword, and I'll cut this code out, and we're just going to do it right inside the file. So there's nothing stopping you with these methods defining the file, like defining the methods inside the same file. And I think this should work. And then we'll eventually refactor it out of here into a different area. But I think this is a good start. So does that seem right? Like if you were to look at this code, like if I kind of cut this out or collapse this, can I collapse? Yeah. Would that feel like right to you? I mean, the clarity of it being currently in this thing, but I don't know how you feel about it, Eric.
Yeah, no, I like it. The only thing that came to my brain is that maybe we would want to call it check and set default NTP servers, because that's kind of really more what it's doing.
Yeah, that is true. Yeah, so you're right. So really check and set. Well, let's do check and set here. Check and set. And then
because if we're just setting, right, then we're just implying that we're taking default values and just setting those default values, but really we want to see if default values exist, and then if not, set some stuff.
Yeah, that's definitely true. So let's run this, and everything should work, right? We've got the method defined inside of there. And honestly, this whole move right here, as someone that's done a lot of Ruby, this move, when we say include ops code NTP helpers, this is literally, not literally, but I guess what I mean to say is like, essentially what it's doing is it takes any of these defined methods that are inside of this module, and it's almost as if like where you see that line right there, it's really just defining them. It's like copying them over. Modules in Ruby are a way for us to hand methods to other objects and other locations and things like that. And it's pretty powerful. So we can start out with just this defining the method inside of here and then eventually move it out. That's a good starting point. And I like to do that because it's less files to begin with. And that passes, so that's good. Yeah, you're definitely right. So check and set default NTP server, and it's because of this line right here. Another alternative implementation is we could call it back to set the NTP default if the node is empty, right? We could define it that way. That isn't quite as interesting. I kind of like the idea of check and set. What I like about check and set is that it's more clear versus set. So I definitely think it's improving.
Yeah.
What I don't like about check and set is that it's a method with like two operations going on, and it's a conditional that says hey whether to go or not. And I should say, if we did this implementation, I think the implementation will look something like this. Let's copy and paste this code. Set the default NTP servers. We could move this check outside of it, right? We could take this code outside of that. Check is now no longer in the method, and we would just call this set. Because that's what you're thinking, right? Like really, set default NTP servers would look something like this. And that's why you feel like check and set is to be this, I assume.
Yeah, I'd say you either do the checking and then you got to do the checking at some point, right? So you can either do it in the helper method or do it outside the helper method and use the resolution of that check to determine whether you do the set or not.
Yeah, and I'm not sure which way I feel about this. The one thing too, what I don't like is this right here. If we say if the node NTP servers is empty, you know what I mean? Like, I think actually it's pretty clear, right? It says, hey, the NTP servers value is empty. My only problem is, of course, in the same way that you might be repeating the NTP server's node variable everywhere. We could even say something like node NTP servers unset or something like that. NTP servers not set, right? So you could write something like this to kind of take care of or describe that. Some people are pretty cool with this. I think in this case, it feels pretty clear. I'm used to kind of seeing node attributes being used.
Here's another thought. We could have two helper methods. We could have set default NTP servers, and then we could have like check default NTP servers or check and set NTP, which just basically goes and does the empty check, and then if so, it calls the other helper method. So in other words, if that resolves true as being empty, then we can just call the set default NTP server helper method. That way, we have the set default NTP server helper method, which is just sort of a pure thing that does the setting, which we can use in other aspects of our code if necessary. So we're not bound by that check,
Yeah, no, that's right. I mean, that's exactly why we could do something like this. I think this is, how do you feel about this? Set default NTP servers if NTP default servers are set. Kind of a reverse of the statement there almost, but actually let's just call it default NTP servers set. Now, you notice I put a question mark at the end of the method, and I like that. I call it the Ron Burgundy type of thing. You go set default NTP servers if default NTP servers are set. You go up at the end right there. For those that have seen a little bit of Anchorman. What's nice in Ruby is that you can actually define methods with question marks. So we can define a method with question marks that really would just be this check right here, which is really you just need to return this value. And that's why I'm saying like that check that you're talking about could just really be renamed if you think it's going to be something more useful. And that's actually, looking ahead, I would definitely feel like that's almost necessary for some of this code, right? Where you're like clicking and you're looking at it, it says if NTP listen is nil and it's not and the and it's not nil and the listen network is not nil, right? You know what I mean? Like this is one of those things where you could replace that functionality with a method that's more helpful to describe the check. So I think you bring up a good point in terms of like the check itself is an important thing, like that's an important piece, and the actual execution is an important piece. And sometimes creating methods for both of those could really be useful in terms of providing clarity in your code. So, as the
Yeah.
guest, what do you want to do of all the things we have here? Thinking about all the possibilities, I leave it to you.
I liked our last idea. This one, I like the idea of having a check, and then also having something that sets the default.
Okay. So this one right here, set default NTP servers if default NTP servers are set, and then we kind of leave that
Totally.
like that.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
like that.
Okay. Yeah, and the nice part is, if we needed to check that in multiple locations, we could use this check in other locations, right? That's the brilliance of, putting things into these functions if we're going to do it, both for clarity and reusability. So I'll comment these ones out. And really, because we have tests that ensure that this code, well, hopefully for this code, then I think we've got this. So here, this should pass because everything is the same in terms of logical sort of thing. I've got two methods, and really I'm just calling these methods with these two separate components. And I think everything should pass. We should try to generate an error for ourselves, as always, to kind of see if our tests are actually doing the work we wanted to do.
Do we want to take a look at the tests?
Yeah, we should. That would be a good thing to look at. Let me make this one change, and then we'll take a look at the test. So if I don't set these default NTP servers and I were to run these tests right here, let's see, hopefully we'll see an error. But yeah, let's take a look at the test while we do that. So I'm gonna keep this up right here. So let's look under the default spec, because I think spec unit recipes default spec. And I'll shrink you down a little bit. There, Eric, you become shrunk. All right, so here we are. There's the NTP default recipe. So this is the NTP Cookbook default recipe. It's using a Solar runner to converge the described recipe. We could probably replace that with the described recipe helper. It installs the NTP package on a virtualized guest, so on some sort of virtualization. If you converge the default recipe, it should disable Tinker Panic. Oh, that's interesting. Okay. Learning a little bit about, I like this. See, it's like executable documentation. I get to see a little bit more about what's happening with the implementation. The varlib.dir directory. Let the directory equals varlib ntp. It creates this directory. It is owned by NTP. Oh, and so this directory is referring to this directory up here. So this first one is checking to make sure it gets created, and then it's asserting, oh, I like this implementation. I never thought about this. I like, when I've done find my specs, I don't usually do it this way, but I really like what they've done here, which is define the resource that you're talking about, and you're saying the context about this thing, and then you're making assertions on each one of them. I like that. That's really a nice implementation. All right. And then it says the stats directory, very similar, creating it. The leap file, so here's another file. Again, so it's very similar. Make sure the file's there. Make sure it's owned by the right person. Again, the comp file. Oh, I like this. I like the way the tests are laid out here. Okay. It does not execute the for sync. It starts the service. It starts it on reboot. So what we want to see is not listen related stuff, but default values. Hopefully there is some tests that actually test the defaults. Let's see if we got any failures, and then that usually tells us where we've got some failures. So it looks like we have two failures. All right, so we got two failures. Attribute spec 84 and then default spec 86. So I'm going to jump to line 86 instead of here, because that's what it's telling me. There's a failure on line 86. Line 86 says this right here, default spec, line 86. NTP attribute on unknown platform sets the upstream servers. Oh, that's the attribute spec. NTP default, the NTP comp has the chef marker and server entries. Oh, this must be where it's just testing. This gets written out with the default values. Maybe. It says, I expect the chef run to render the NTP comp file with the content generated by chef. I expect it to render this file with the content Tinker Panic 1000. I expect it to render this file, and I bet these are probably those default values that it's expecting in there, or at least one of the default values.
Yeah,
So
can we go back to the default values and take a look? Some of those things look kind of familiar there.
The attributes or the
defaults, server defaults.
Server defaults, as in like
the ones that we just refactored.
Oh, got it. That's right. Yeah, let's take a look at those. So here, yeah, server 0. Let me open up on the other side here, and I'll go to the default recipe. What was it? 84. We're looking at server 0. I think what you caught intelligently is this 0.pool.ntp.org.
Yeah.
Which is over here 0.pool.ntp.org. Yep. So it's not directly testing defaults, but it's assuming that they're actually being written to the file in this test.
I have another thought. What if we just, if we set these values in the attributes file themselves, would we still have to check? I guess we would, huh? Because there's still a possibility that it could get overridden with blank.
Yeah, that's very true. They could get overridden with blank or something like that. Yeah, that's
something
that can happen.
And because of the attribute precedence level, we would have to check it here before we did any other stuff anyway, so that's true.
Yeah, the one thing you do bring up, though, would be good is we don't have an explicit test on these attributes itself. So there's a test that sort of indirectly tested this right here. We don't have a test that says something like, and I put it right above maybe the listen, because, inside of here, the next thing that happens is a listen clause, but it's like the context. We might want to check for the NTP default servers, or we could say like when no default servers are specified. When no default servers are specified, like we could say it has the default servers, it defaults the values. I guess it sets the default. Right, so we could write a test like this, and let me turn off wrapping for a second. Oops, I lost my test with that wrapping change. Oh, there we go. Okay, so sets the default servers. Here we could say, I expect the chef run. And if we look at all these ones up above, and let me shrink this code a little bit here. Notice this one is checking a node attribute, which is we could say something like, I expect the node attribute NTP servers to, I could say, include one of these entries, right? I could say it includes 0. This right here. I think that's include might be the wrong method. So we're going to take a moment to look this up. So I'm going to go to RSpec documentation for a second. I don't know if you know. I'm trying to...
I don't know off the top of my head, but isn't that going to fail if it's been overridden with other user-specified attribute values that don't include 0.pool.ntp.org?
Yeah, it would fail. In this case, in this run, in this context, I don't believe we've got anything specified. We'd have to look at the parent context, the context that sort of surrounds this, and see if there are any specified. We could also ensure that for this context, we could say, make sure that the node object or the run within this, essentially within this run, it doesn't actually set those values. But let me look at the documentation just for this, and then the API documentation for RSpec is all on Relish app. I want to look at the basic default matchers, because this is one that kind of steps out of the sort of default, like, is it equal, when you're looking for something right there. So here's the expectations, and the expectations, I'm going to look for built-in matchers, because again, ChefSpec is built on top of RSpec. So I want to look to see where are the possible ones. So we could say, does it empty? Yeah, there we go. Include. To include expected value. So a collection membership, that's what we're looking at. We're looking at an array of items. So you're thinking here with the chef run. So you notice this one says like in the chef run, you could set up a solo runner that sets this value initially. We could maybe more explicitly state here that the NTP servers is empty, right? Because that's kind of the test, which is this right here. I think that's right. So this says chef runner, the servers is empty, right? It's empty right there. And converge recipe. So let's run just this test on line 223. So we could run all the tests, but I'm going to run rspec unit recipes default spec, and you can use a colon symbol. Notice these right here, the colons. They tell you when you can run one again. I'm going to do 223. Ooh, excuse me. Ooh. I got to get a shush so I can mute my mic. Okay, that fails. Let's go back to the actual code here, and let me uncomment this and run this again. So we have a nice quick test, and hopefully this will pass. Oh, that fails. So I expect the NTP servers to include 0.pool.ntp.org when NTP servers is empty. And I believe that looks right. Node set NTP servers equals empty, converge the default recipe, and I'm asking for that value. I'm going to do something really quick because I don't understand why that's happening. So I'm going to use...
And we're sure that those aren't being set by default in the attributes file.
Yeah, that's what I want to check. I thought maybe this would override that here if I said that inside of this, but apparently it's not. So I'm going to set up a breakpoint, and then I want to look at the node object of the chef run and see what's going on. So here I am at that breakpoint. I have the chef run.node object. I'm just going to look at it. And there it is. It says NTP servers, and it is blank. So something leads me to believe that, you know, why doesn't that get set correctly is interesting, because it's going to apply this recipe, which is set the default NTP servers if the default NTP servers are set. You know, let me do one thing right here, which is take this breakpoint and I'll move it over to here. And let's exit for a second. So now I'm going to move the breakpoint into the recipe itself. So let me run over here. So now looking at the code, I have a breakpoint here. We're at this moment in time. I want to look at the node object. So let me make this bigger. Here's the node object. If I were to say node NTP servers, I would see that, is it empty? It happens to be empty, right? So that was our check here in the code, which is make sure it's empty. And if it is empty, set the default attribute. So we could even call this method, right? So that returns true. So what happens if we call set the default NTP servers?
Well,
okay.
We could just run that whole line, couldn't we? So we could run set default NTP servers if default NTP server set question mark.
Yeah, we could run that. And it looks like it's running there. And you'll notice it tells us it's returning back to us the monologger. And the reason why it says monologger being returned back to us is that in Ruby, the last line inside of the function is essentially, let me split it down here. Actually, that would be really nice. Let me do a little reorganizing. Here, I'll open up that default recipe. Well, that's not the default recipe. Yep, there we go. Yeah, that is, where was I in the file? I was in 223. That is the last line in the function call. So the last line in the function call is a chef log message. So it's returning whatever that chef log object is or something like that. So That seems like it's working. So if we look at the node object and I ask for the node object to give me this empty servers, it still says it's empty though.
Yeah, that's weird.
That is weird why it would say it's empty, because we're setting that, or at least it looks like we're setting it. We're saying node.default. You know what it is though?
Well, why don't you call set default NTP servers, and then check the node object.
I think I got, wait, this is, I think the problem is that NTP servers. Here, you notice I use set here? I think set is at a higher level than the default. Let me just disable this instead. If you don't mind, I'll just try that again. I think that's what it is. Because what happens here is that this NTP servers is being set, and I think that might be set at a normal level. So let's look at the node object again, and let's look at NTP, and let's look at servers. And I think actually, look, servers are already set by default to that value. And let's run this line again that you were saying we could run. Does that make sense? I think that's what might be what's happening. I think the set level might be a little bit different. It is. So this is a problem right here. So it happens that I don't need to do this, and if I were to do this, I'd probably need to make sure that I don't know, like default, or I don't know what the right thing is. So I'm going to leave that off right now. I'm assuming it's the normal converge, so I don't think we need that. I think this will pass. So I'm going to do an exit one more time. I'm going to unbreakpoint me and then run that same spec again. And I think that looks good. Yeah, that looks right. So I think we have the right test there. Okay.
And then if you went into like somewhere and set that value and then ran the test, would it pass?
If I were to...
Yeah, if you were to set the value of NTP servers somewhere.
And then run that test. I think what you're saying is...
like chef.io or something.
Right, so you're saying if we actually were to set it, so when default servers are specified to, it does not, right? That kind of thing? Does not set?
That's what I was thinking, yeah.
Yeah, all right, that's a great test, yep. So we want something like this, and we want to say not to include, yeah, you're right, I should have left that code up there, which is this, which is...
well, but then you run into the problem of, what if they actually do want to set it to 0.pool.whatever, right?
Yeah, but for our test, we know we don't have to worry about that, right? Like for our test, we'll do our solo runner, and we'll use our runner to converge the NTP : default, and then here we'll say node.set, and we won't set this to 0. Right? Don't just say node dot. Oh, probably runner dot node dot. See, this is new for me. Runner dot node dot set. So we'll say runner dot node dot set, and then you said something like NTP servers, and we'll set this to the list. And our list is going to be ntp.chef.io. Yeah, I think that covers that. So
yeah, that will ensure that the defaults don't get triggered if you have an item in there.
Yeah, I think actually while I ran the same test again, that should actually cover the same test we're hoping for. So here's a way to do this. If this is passing, I think this is passing, right? Yeah, this is passing. So this is on line 229. Let me make more explicitly call out this example, or this expectation in this example that I want to run. And more so that it doesn't include one of the defaults, because it's kind of magical that this says this is like a default right here. We might want to say more explicitly, like it sets the default, it uses, it respects the specified default servers. Right, so that might be something where you talk about.
I would just call them specified servers, not specified default servers.
Okay. Oh, that's right. Specified servers. And then in this case, we could write the positive test, which is the positive test is I expect it to include ntp.chef.io. That might be the better test to write. This one saying not include is not so great. Plus, it's kind of magical that this is here. Why would this be here? How do we know this is a default? If we did do something, and that passes, so this works. Oh wait, but I didn't run the right test, did I? 229. No, I did write the. Oh no, that's the right test. Okay, so 229 is the right test, so that worked. Yeah, we might do something like this. A default server, right, or something like that. We might be very clear about what this thing happens to be. And that sounds crazy, but
no, that's way better. Yeah.
So we know that why is that just magically there? Because that's one of those things where I always come back, months later, and I'm like, what is this value? Why do I have this content? What's this all
Totally.
about? So,
yeah.
All right, that's good. You've definitely helped guide the right values, the right feeling in these tests here, because that's something I was immediately moving away from, and I'm glad you pulled me back here. All right, so that looks good. Set the default NTP servers if the default NTP servers are set. So we define these methods inside of here. There's one last refactor I think I want to do, which is this right here. So notice we have this method. And this is a small thing. As someone who spent a lot of time in the Ruby community, we try to write these methods that are very small and very short and very clear. And there's this little part right here, which is setting the default NTP servers. But there's this little bit of information inside of this thing, which is really, I want to say, just default NTP servers. And I think what I'd like to do is have a method that says default NTP servers, right? Because this would give a good name to the content right there. And later, if I wanted to change the defaults, I could just come in here and change it. We might be able to use the defaults actually in our test. So that's something we could possibly even load up, and so we don't have to repeat it or generate additional helpers. So that's a nice little thing. So let me run the entire. Yeah, it's just a small little refactor, but it's one of those things where it does make you do a lot more sort of redirecting to look, but you have to balance that. You have to balance the level of like, how many little methods do I want? And I think for clarity's sake, I like little small methods because it's easier for me to keep track of it. And that's something that's going on. I think this might be a little bit easier to keep track of. Because this is almost synonymous. When you see this, you're like, yep, that's the default list of NTP servers. And you're saying, set that value, the default NTP servers here.
Yep.
Right.
Much cleaner.
Yeah, we're good. So we got, this is all passing. So if we want this to work as a helper method, now that we've done all this work into here, well, let me clean up the other stuff here. So let's delete this. Our initial sort of talk. That was great to kind of work through that. And then we'll move through and take this code right here. And I'm going to take it, and I'm just going to now move this over to the NTP helper module that's already been created. And of course, if your cookbook doesn't have one of these, you can easily just create one, right? Like, there's nothing stopping you from creating that, essentially that module and including it in the same way that this cookbook does. So let's just run the test again. All I've done is moved I liked it. I liked starting out inside of the recipe itself. And then now that we've kind of defined it, moved it into the helper sort of area itself, because that way it's easier. It's in the same file. You don't have to think about it. And you don't have to worry about like, am I doing the include, Ruby stuff correctly? And I think what we've got is something that works pretty well, and it should be. Ooh,
yeah,
see?
let's once we get it passed, let's see how we're doing here.
Yeah, if you look at it, it says no resource or method name default NTP servers set. I wonder, did I save it? Default NTP servers set. I have it here. I saved it. And you know what? I wonder, did this fail in the NTP recipes 29? So it's telling me on recipes, the default 29, there is a failure. And the failure is exactly what we're thinking, which is on 29, we're using this method, and the method no longer exists. Let's run this one more time. Maybe I've saved everything correctly at this point. I might have been talking and not saving files, which happens sometimes. So.
Doesn't your Atom auto save?
No, I don't. I don't have it auto saving on me. That's something you could do. I know there's a plugin for that. It looks like we are getting a failure, which is saying no resource or method name default NTP server set for chef recipe default.
I
So
saw
my,
some. Let's go back to the handler for a sec.
yeah.
No, not the recipe, the
Oh,
handler.
and then the NTP helper, yeah. So we are in opscode NTP helper. We are a method that's defined here similar to this. NTP supports native leap files. We did copy these over and they worked when they were in the other location. And it's interesting.
Can we go see where the other helper is being used?
Yeah, let's take a look. So NTP supports native help files. If I go to the recipe itself, I see it later down in the file. So does something happen in between its usage here and its include, or essentially why are we seeing a failure here and not there? It's interesting why we're getting that error. Well, I've saved it. Let me just make sure my editor is telling me everything I hope it would tell me. So git diff libraries, I can look at all the files that are different there, and those are my 3 methods that have been added. And then git diff the recipes. Oops. That looks good. So that was all that code we initially moved for the default client. And then we have our helper methods that are being used. I do notice the difference between the two is that this one is being used in a lazy evaluation, but I don't know if that's incredibly important that the lazy evaluation is being used. I don't think that should affect it. I think I know why the lazy evaluation is being used, but I don't think that's what's causing or sort of making this functionality different or why ours isn't working.
Well, if it's lazy, then that means that those methods aren't being loaded until they're called, right?
Yeah, they're loaded. I guess they get loaded or they're available in the namespace of the recipe right away. Oh, you know what? You notice this? It says chef resource. We're inside of a recipe. The failure here. So let me just kind of show you this. So we're inside of a recipe, not a resource, and that makes a huge difference. Okay. So I'm going to run the test again, and this is going to breakpoint on the first breakpoint. And you'll notice something when we look at the breakpoint here. It tells us right here the context of the object you currently are in at the moment. So how it says chef recipe right there, we're inside of a chef recipe. So do we have set default NTP servers? No, we don't actually, because nothing's in chef recipe. But if we were to change into chef resource, right? You remember I was talking about these helper methods. This chef resource is getting the helper methods, not the recipe. So if we want the recipe to get our helper method, we would need to do something like that.
Well,
So the
so
rest,
is this a good case then to create an additional helper method? Because if one is required in the resource and one we want in the recipe, we don't necessarily want all the other stuff in each of the other, if that makes sense.
yeah, no, that totally makes sense. That's right. Yeah, I would say that definitely. So right now I'm going to use the same file. Oh, let's go back to actually kind of dream-driven development, like, oh, sorry, default recipe. So yeah, let's say NTP helper. So that's kind of helper. Let's just call this the servers. We'll just call this the very explicit, the default NTP server helper. Let me shrink you a little bit here. Helper. And I'll take that name right here and we'll go to
Do
the
we want to
NTP
just
helper.
call it like default helper or core helper or something like that? Because we might later on down the road want to add some things that aren't
Sure.
server specific.
Yeah. I didn't know if I was kind of being explicit until we got the refactor for it.
I got you.
Because
Okay,
yeah,
I'm cool with that too.
Yeah, that's a good thing to think about. Like, do you name it something that's more explicit, or do you name it, it's a good concern. So I'm going to do something not great. I think it should be in its own file, but for right now, to get things to pass, again, instead of me making another file, I'm going to use the module. I'm going to define it here, and I'm going to take all our things over here. The other thing too is you could, Eric, you could make smaller modules, and each one have their own functionality in it. And so that's something that we could do. So here we did, it says ops code NTP Default NTP Server helper, and all our methods are defined now in this module. This module is like a sibling of this module right here, so they're kind of, just in a different directory structure, right? So now that we included it inside of the recipe, I think we should be able to see it working here. So I think I've left a pry line. Actually, I've deleted it. So I'm going to exit. And I think we're going to see, or hopefully see, passing this time around. Yeah, you bring up a good point. So that's whether we want to do that or not is something up to you. So you could sort of generically call it something like that. Or you could decide to make it more specific and then include a bunch of little helpers and then maybe merge the helpers over time. I try to go for, I guess my rule is maybe go for the explicit until you want to go generic, and when the generic makes a lot of sense. But I could see either way.
Yeah, I usually go the other way around, where I'll start generic until the generic gets too big that it needs to be broken up,
Yeah, yeah. That's I guess my fear in that strategy for me is that if you looked at my office, like I think you get a picture of it from behind me. It's not too messy, but if you look at the other side, you're not seeing. There's just stacks of stuff. So someone like you, it sounds like you like you keep perhaps a good working environment, good clean environment in a lot of cases. If you're on the other side of it, it may be like I tend to just kind of throw stuff into a bucket, or throw something in a space. So I try to be mindful and make little stacks and clean sort of arrangements of things. So that's one of those things. It's a good team's dynamic or flow to figure out. Yeah.
All right. It's funny too. Some people will have a very chaotic sort of workspace around them, but their digital life and their digital files will be like really, really organized.
Yeah, that's definitely the case. I used to be a lot more organized, and now I've gotten lazier in more areas of my life. Like, it used to be every directory, every auto exec back and config sys, and every file was meticulously, crafted and pruned. And now it's like, there's this stuff on my desktop, both literally and virtually. All right. I feel good about these small changes we made, particularly this one, which was a surprise. This one right here, just kind of including the content in a separate recipe. And then this one created some good conversations and some good just kind of work out of it. We wrote some great tests that went with it. Besides the great tests that we wrote alongside of it, we actually learned a little bit about, this thing, or at least I introduced you to this thought.
Totally. That was great.
Yeah, the reason why this one's working, to kind of give you an idea before we leave, is that, remember, these are all resources, and when you're inside of this do and end, so right here, and actually let me just show you that. So require pry.
Yeah, because you're inside of a resource at that point, right?
Yeah, you're inside of the resource. So being inside of the resource, we're going to see a different prompt. So it's not going to say chef : recipe. It should say chef : resource : template. We're in a different scope. And remember, these methods are being included into a particular scope. So we're kind of like, boosting the existing, sort of class object, the resource object, but only for for these ones, which is good. It's a good idea to make sure that you only include methods in the right area. And you were right, like, we don't want to just immediately take this helper method, NTPD supports native leap files, and put it everywhere, because that's not a good idea in the event that, could cause some problems. So it's nice to isolate it like we did. Yeah. I mean, even more specifically, you could even target the template resource. So you notice in the breakpoint here, we're talking specifically about the chef resource : template. The author decided here to just make it generically for all resources, which it's not being used in other places, but it's not too terrible to have it sort of generic here.
Let's make that change and just see that it works. Can we do that?
Oh yeah, do you want to see it in there? Yeah. All right, let's do that. I'm going to exit
Yeah,
here.
let's just specify that it's for the template resource.
So resource : template, I believe is what that was on the prompt. Let's go back here to see it. Yeah, chef resource : template. Yeah,
Yeah.
and let's run the test again. And I took out the breakpoint, so everything should just pass. And as long as that helper is not being used in other locations.
I guess we'll find out.
Yeah, that's the beauty, of course, if our tests are working. And that looks good, so that passes. All right. Well,
Sweet.
yeah, it looks like we're just about out of time, so let's get back to just big heads here and we can start talking to each other. All right.
That was good.
So,
That was good timing.
yeah, it was perfect. Yeah. So in this episode, we presented with some legacy code that we were able to understand, just walk through. I find it a big help to have another person here with me to kind of talk about it and walk through and chat about it. So Eric, thank you so much for coming along on the journey and then providing your insights, because I think ultimately the code, if we were building this together like we were, but if this was real production code, I think we'd have a better solution that is more clear for everybody that works with it. So we got to see a little bit of this in terms of helper methods. We got to explore some of the kind of interesting things about include there. Remember, as always, with your skills that you learn or you practice here in any of these kind of situations, to use them judiciously. So when you're refactoring or sort of changing the code that you're working with, there's got to be tests, and make sure you're doing it right, like with the right code that's giving you the most bang for the buck in terms of what's impacting your velocity, what is able to make you move faster, what's going to help your team get bigger, move faster, type of thing. All right. Well, thank you, Eric.
Yeah, thank you very much. Had a good time. It was fun.
And thank you again, everybody that's out there watching. I appreciate it. Happy automate.